Hey class, let's talk about the endocrine system. This is a great organ system with lots of cool structures and functions in your body. Now, the first thing we want to do is figure out overall what are we going to be talking about. And the two words are endocrine, of course, and hormones. And usually we're talking like this. There's an endocrine gland that makes this hormone that does this thing. And that's a pretty good starting point. I want to tell you it's a little more nuanced than that, meaning some endocrine glands are in the brain, which means they're brain matter, so are they really glands? Maybe not. And the stuff they're making, well, maybe they're not really hormones if they're not really glands, so there's other names for those. The point is, we're just going to keep it simple. Yeah, we'll call them glands, we'll call them hormones, but there's a lot of complexity here, especially when you start talking about these glands and hormones in the brain. But to keep it simple, look at your screen here. You'll see there's this figure with all of these different glands listed, starting way up in the brain, all the way down to the gonad. So those are our major endocrine glands. But a note here on the side shows you that there are other organs in your body that have secondary endocrine functions. Like the heart can make a hormone, that can make a hormone that helps regulate appetite, your digestive tract, your kidneys. Some of these parts of your body, we will talk about the hormones that they make later on, but mostly we'll just hit the major ones now over on this side of your screen. So what is a gland? It's just a bunch of cells that make something. A cluster of cells that secrete a product. Exocrine glands, we've already talked about. Back in Unit 1, they secrete their product onto the surface of the body, or maybe indirectly into some passage that can reach the surface of the body through ducts, right? So this concept of ducts is a major element here. In fact, in this picture, over to the side here of this exocrine gland, you can see that there are cells secreting a product and things go into these ducts to reach the body surface or whatever. So ducts are crucial to exocrine glands. You already know about exocrine glands, at least 7. So now's a good time to pause it. Think about how many you can name. You didn't pause it. You're just going to wait for me to tell you. It's fine. That's fine. If that's what you want to do. Sweat glands, oil glands, lacrimal glands, mammary glands, earwax glands, mucus glands, gastric glands. There's probably even more. Salivary glands. Did we say that? I don't know. Maybe you can think of even more. But we've done a bunch of these exocrine glands already. What we'll talk about today is endocrine glands, but they are very different. Mainly, they have no ducts and they make hormones. They make no ducts because if you check out this endocrine gland on your screen, there's a cluster of cells here in the middle, and hormones travel in the blood. So you don't need any ducts. They're just going to diffuse out of the cell membrane or be transported out of the cells and into the blood. Some glands, by the way, can be both exocrine and endocrine. So like gonads, they make sex hormones. That's endocrine. But sperm and eggs can eventually leave the body. So maybe as a fertilized egg person, but also just as eggs and sperm. So endocrine and exocrine. The pancreas makes insulin and glucagon. These are two different hormones, so that's endocrine. But they also make digestive juices, squirt into the intestines, and the intestines are more or less open to the body through the long process of food going through the digestive tract, but eventually will reach the exit of the body. So both of these structures, gonads meaning testes and ovaries, and pancreas are dual purpose, endocrine, yes, and exocrine. And finally, a hormone is a chemical messenger made by an endocrine gland that affects the behavior of other glands or tissues. So hormone means to excite, so they're causing some excitation. Now, these hormones only affect the parts of your bodies that have target cells, that are receptors, have receptors. If they don't have receptors, the hormones just swish right past the cells. They don't bind to anything, nothing changes. But if they find a receptor on a target cell, then they can alter metabolic activities. And what I mean by that are things like this, like change the cell membrane permeability. So suddenly more things can come in or come out of the cell, which change everything about the cell. They can activate the synthesis of proteins. We know proteins do a lot for the cell. Enzymes, they can stimulate cell division. Lots of cellular processes are affected by hormones. Now, as with most of the organ systems here, we don't really have a super firm grasp on how everything in this system works. This paper is back from 1994. It's called The Effects of Gender and Birth Control Pill Use on Spontaneous Blink Rates. So what they did here was some researchers took 59 men and 86 women, and they just monitored them to see how much they blinked. Probably they pretended they were doing some other study. Because if you know someone's watching you blink, you might not blink so much. But so they counted their blinks. And they knew that some of the women were on birth control and some weren't. And at the end of the study, they found females on birth control blinked about 19.6 times per minute, but females not on birth control blinked about 14.9. So about 20 if you had birth control, 15 if you didn't, and males blinked about 15 times if you didn't. So something about taking the birth control affected blink rate. And presumably it wasn't the act of putting the pill in your mouth and drinking a sip of water, right? Something about the hormones in the birth control affected birth rate. And so the researchers, as you can read, they monitored for differences in, like, did the women wear contact lenses, or how fast did their tears break up? These Schirmer tests, these are like dry eye tests. They looked at temperature and humidity in their research room, their age, menstrual cycle phase, all of that stuff. And nothing explained this difference except the birth control pills. So the reason that birth control pills and their hormones affect blink rate is totally unknown, because I don't know, no one can figure it out. And I've looked to see if in the past almost 20 years, whether or not we've figured this out, and there's nothing. We have looked at blink rate in infants to see if that can give us a clue about their health. We've looked at blink rate and smoking weed and driving, and whether or not the cops could figure out if you were under the influence of weed by counting your blinking, stuff like that. But as far as birth control and how hormones affect blinking, there's nothing else out there. So it's interesting stuff still, confusing. A little bit more housekeeping about hormones. There's two main types of hormones, steroid hormones and peptide hormones. So the difference between the steroid and peptide hormones is, where do they affect their target cells? Where do they find receptors? Steroid hormones can actually enter the cell. I kind of think about like steroids, like anabolic steroids that build muscle, and like the steroid hormones like bust into the cell and they make it all the way into the nucleus. Inside the nucleus, they can affect like what the DNA is up to. So they can have a really major and direct influence on the target cells. Peptide hormones, on the other hand, which just means proteins, protein hormones, they can't get through the cell membrane. So they definitely can't get to the nucleus. All they can do is bind with a receptor on the surface of the cell and then initiate some cascading reaction. It causes this to happen, which causes this to happen. So very different abilities to influence cellular activities. There's also this concept of how hormones are released. So we have three types of hormone release here: humoral, neural, and hormonal. Humor is a fluid. So this is a fluid-based release of hormones. And more specifically, what that means is you have something in your body, a little monitoring station, and it's watching the fluid. Let's say blood. So there's little cells monitoring your blood. If there's a sudden change in the concentration of something in your blood, like maybe calcium, then these monitoring stations will identify that problem in your fluid and cause a hormonal release to fix the problem. So humor is fluid. The fluid's being monitored, And if something's off, a hormone gets released to fix it. Neural control of hormone release is that the nervous system is involved, and it's going to basically zap something and tell it to release hormones. And the example here is the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal glands sit on the kidneys. That's what adrenal means, above or on top of the kidneys. And these glands have an outer part called the cortex and an inner medulla. And they're very, 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 very different. So that's important. It's the medulla, the inside of the adrenal gland, in which the nervous system is directly connected. This long neuron comes all the way down through the central nervous system into the adrenal medulla, and it'll zap it when it wants to release some epinephrine. So that's neural control. The last way that you can control when hormones are released is through hormonal control of hormone release. So hormonal control means that you have some regulatory hormone, and that hormone will cause the release of a different hormone. As we'll discuss soon, the pituitary gland, it used to be called the master gland, and we'll talk about why later. But this master gland made all of these hormones that could regulate the behavior of other hormones or regulate when they're released. So as you can see in our picture here, this pituitary gland up here, whether or not it releases these hormones and these hormones and these hormones determines whether or not these hormones and these hormones and these hormones get released. So it's these regulatory hormones made by the pituitary gland control the hormonal release of these other hormones. Our last concept here before we move into actually looking at the endocrine glands and the specific hormones they make is to remember that hormone release uses this negative feedback mechanism. And I have a video about this that I posted earlier of me standing in front of a thermostat kind of talking through this. But this concept of negative feedback can be described kind of like a thermostat in that if things are out of whack in one direction, like your house is too cold, your thermostat can automatically kick on. And it'll heat up the house and heat up the house until you get to a certain point, and then the thermostat will kick off. But if things drop too low again, the thermostat will kick on, and it'll kick off and on and off. So that's the concept of negative feedback in hormone release.